Thank you for coming to our session. You had other really good choices too, so we appreciate you picking our session. We're excited to be here. This is our first year here, and our first year obviously then to present, so we're a little intimidated, especially because we're on video too. So thank you for coming. This session is Kicking and Screaming, which the idea behind it is really that you spend an awful lot of time working with students who completely try to avoid any critical thinking at all. And they really, you have to pull it to them, and they're, or pull them to it, and they're just kicking and screaming. All they really want to do is know exactly what's on the test, and they just want to be able to regurgitate it right back to you. And so that's where the idea of this session came from. We're really low tech, so hopefully you weren't expecting a lot of technology stuff in this session. But critical thinking certainly is important, and it's going to cover all of your classes, and it's exactly what we're driving for with the students. So I'm going to start first. Brains before beauty, right?
Yes.
So I'm going first. My name is Heidi Helgren. I'm an attorney, actually, by trade. I have a bachelor's degree in political science, and then I went to law school. So case studies and the critical thinking thing have always just been natural for me. Like, I enjoy classes with a Socratic method and analyzing cases to death, but I know that's not common for a lot of people, and you may not enjoy case studies, so hopefully after this session we'll win you over to it. But basically, I'm an associate professor now in management, and then I also coordinate our legal support program, which is kind of like a legal secretary, paralegal program at Delta College. Delta College is located in Michigan. We're like an hour and a half north of Detroit. We cover, we're in the center of 3 counties actually, and it's called the Great Lakes Bay region now. They just jazzed up the name a few years ago, so that's where we're from.
And I'm Bruce Kemmer. I'm a certified management accountant, and prior to teaching I was a CFO in a small manufacturing company, so the concept of case studies and needing to be analytical and understand cause and effect comes, I don't know, naturally, but trained. I've also been an associate professor of management. Heidi and I teach together, and I typically teach the entry-level classes, which kind of feed Heidi's 200 level, and so we try to coordinate between each other this concept of, using case studies to activate critical thinking, so that by the time her students come in, they've had some of that experience in some of my classes, so that it's not quite as much of a shock to their system. So
you kind of weed some out for me, I think, to my classes. But I'm big on quotes, and Martin Luther King, here's a good quote from him too. The function of education is to teach people to think critically, really, and I think that's probably why you're all here, to help drive that skill. Now, I'm not going to read all this to you. I know that this will be accessible on the website later on, so you'll be able to have it. But the idea of critical thinking, really, for me, is when it's like that spark you get, which is probably why so many of you are teaching. It's when the students finally get to the point where they start second-guessing what they've always thought was true. And since I teach the law classes, they all come in thinking that they know everything because they watch Judge Judy and they watch CSI. Yeah. And it's so bad, or their girlfriend's brother's uncle's sister, something, babysitter, went to court and had this experience, and they think that is an honest-to-God true, and it, of course, rarely is. And so for me, the big thing is when I can finally get them to start second-guessing it, and that's a lot of that critical thinking then, too. Being able to analyze it, being curious about it, second-guessing what they've always thought, and kind of going against maybe what their default sort of like basic freshman student responses to an awful lot of stuff. And so one of the questions I think that comes up a lot of times is, can't we all just do it? We can all do it in this room because we've been through it. And so what's the problem with our students? Like, why do they fight it? Can't they just do it? Didn't they learn it in K through 12? Well, they're not. But it feels like they should have. I mean, we kind of did, I think. I felt like I did a little bit, and it's, that's coming down, right? Well, I suppose human nature, at least, and then if they're not developing it in K through 12, you come out kind of thinking bias, you have prejudices, it costs businesses a lot of money, they just don't have all the information they think they do, just like they think they know how to use the internet correctly and they can find resources, and they can't. And then this last one's, totally mine. It's partial, or like what I like to say is they're just pretty half-assed when they're coming in, and they just don't even realize what they don't know, and they're just too cocky about it, really. So the critical thinking really has to be developed. And kind of like I mentioned before, critical thinkers then should be able to raise questions. They should be able to design other problems, and they should be able to follow the chain, in the line of thinking. So when you present a certain chunk of material or some kind of, something out of the textbook or a program that you're working on or whatever, a critical thinking student then should be able to anticipate questions that maybe you didn't even think of, which to me makes classes a lot more fun because I'll learn things from my students sometimes because they'll think of things that I didn't, and that's really what you're kind of pushing for anyways. There it is. I lost my arrow. We do an awful lot of our assessment based on Bloom's taxonomy, and I'm assuming everybody in here, maybe you know about Bloom, or you use that, right? He came up with a list of, they're Bloom's, I keep losing this mouse. There it is. Bloom's verbs, almost, is kind of like what we call them. And if you've seen these charts before, you've probably seen them in a graph that kind of like slopes up. I presented them in this just a little bit different because I was hoping you could use it as like a cheat sheet later on if you want to do this. We drive all of our program assessment and our course assessment based on these Bloom's verbs. And so when you draft your course outcomes and objectives, you probably start an awful lot, especially at a 100 level class that says things like describe the legal system, or define promissory estoppel, or something like that, where what they're really doing in a 100 level class is kind of like regurgitating some of it back. So I'm not going to go through all these, but here's like sample questions that come out. The process verbs are the ones that we use when we're doing our assessment and putting them in databases for tracking for our accreditation too. So this is the very basic. And then you move up to understanding, where the students are able to ask a little bit of questions. They can kind of discuss stuff or describe it, maybe give some different examples than what you've given in class. You want them to expand on it. They can get to the applying level. That's the third one up. This is where they demonstrate. That seems to be where we get stuck a lot, I've noticed, in our program outcomes, is we want them to demonstrate certain stuff, but it's really only halfway up Bloom's taxonomy. And at least in my view, if they're finishing off, like for us, they finish off with a 2-year degree, we really want those like capstone classes at the end to be much higher level, I would think, than like level 3. But that seems to be what's sort of common in a lot of course outcomes and objectives. So here's where the critical thinking starts a little bit more. This is the 4th level for Bloom's taxonomy and the analyzing. So can they compare and contrast different legal systems? That's something we talk about in my class. Are they able to do the research to find stuff, back it up, create their own graphs maybe? Evaluating, right? Can they make conclusions? And then lastly, this one's really advanced now, if they can create other possible solutions. And I don't necessarily have a lot of that in law, but I would think that you would have that in a lot of different computer classes maybe, where they're able to create and like move up. And that's that highest level for the critical thinking. So. Like I told you, I'm really big on case studies because I've experienced some, for like 20 years in school, and then having taught it, and then practicing law is just nonstop kind of a case study, just one after the other almost too. But the case studies, at least for us, we use a lot because we incorporate them into our capstone classes, but then also because we're occupational faculty. And there seems to be a huge difference between like the gen ed liberal arts faculty and the occupational faculty, like at our institution. And so for occupational, we're preparing them for the workforce, and so they want to see like real life, like hands-on examples, like how is this going to matter for work? And that's really a big part then of case studies, because you can bring in those real scenarios, current events, and then they can help make decisions about what would they do. And so one of the other classes I teach is human resource management, and that's been great once I started incorporating a lot more case studies, because most of our students already work too. They're not just coming to school, and so they've had the bad bosses and the good bosses, and they've hired and fired people, and so getting them to think about it in different ways, and then the legal aspects of it, or what big employers in our area, which happen to be like Dow Chemical and Dow Corning, like what would they do? And, and the students get really jazzed about that, thinking about themselves in a position that you view as so much higher. So,
all right.
I'm turning it over now.
Well, again, Heidi gets the students in the 200 level classes, and I primarily teach the 100 level Introduction to Business, and then I get them in 200 levels, which is Principles of Management. But one of the challenges that we face is we're pretty much an open entry college. I mean, we do have reading prerequisites for the classes, but we're encouraged in some of our gateway classes, which Introduction to Business is to not set the barrier too high. All right, so that creates a number of challenges for me in that we're dealing with students that come from a variety of socioeconomic backgrounds whose skill levels range from people that can take an English comp class and do quite well to people that are in developmental reading and writing as well. So what I try to do right from the get-go is start with some very basic case study approach. I try to explain to them, and for this I stick pretty much to what Cengage provides us in the text, is it's the higher, or I don't know if I call it higher or lower level blooms, but the more just identifying, remembering, pointing out. And the cases that are in the Cengage book work very well for that. And after each chapter, they have a critical thinking exercise. So it kind of gets the ball rolling on it. But at that level, a number of the cases are, well, fairly basic because it's a fairly basic class. And of course, as Heidi mentioned earlier, the students, they like it because a lot of the analysis is pretty straightforward. But our job is to be critical thinkers. So what I tend to do is after about halfway through the semester, again, we have them read the case. I assign it a week ahead of time. I ask them to answer the following. I give them these questions. What's the situation? How does it relate? Is it big or is it minor? Who's going to make the decision? And to do some review. And then when we bring them into the class period, I break them into groups. And I sort of have a requirement that I assign points. They're pretty subjective to all of the exercises, but how I work it, I said, this is all peer pressure. If I'm the one that does all the talking, you all fail. And that's just how I set it up. And so basically all I will do is moderate, and I tell them that they are expected to do 75 to 80% of the talking. And if they do not maintain that, and they grumble and they complain, but it's also, after the first couple of experiences with it, the class seems to typically, not always, kind of coalesce. And then you get them more engaged in just also the other rudimentary stuff that we go through, like the terminology and what have you. So then, as they discuss it, every once in a while I'll interject something if I feel it's appropriate to kind of bring it to a higher level. And then once they're done, because we also have a process or a program, you may all remember it, called Writing to Learn. And we still require 6 writing credits for graduation. And my class is a W class, so one of the things I always make them do is summarize what we did and what they think they learned. And they're not graded necessarily on what their responses are, but they're graded on their attempt to get at the critical points. As the semester goes on, what I try to do is I develop my own cases. And I try to make them things that are interesting or local. I've steered more towards local events the last few years. But I kind of started this approach when the British Petroleum Gulf of Mexico fiasco happened. And of course, I just used the word fiasco, and Heidi had mentioned students come in with bias. And their bias in that situation is British Petroleum was negligent and it was, what have you. But if you go to British Petroleum's website, they will spend a lot of time telling you how they were a socially responsible company. And we have an initiative at our college called Sustainability, and my class is a sustainability level class or type class. And so I make them, in the case, I give them a highlight of what happened. I go over some of the major actions they've done, but then I link it to the web where they have to go to BP's website. Then they have to go to archived articles. And when we're looking at the 2 economic models, or excuse me, social responsible models of economic or socioeconomic, I make them go through and identify all the various items. Now, identifying still kind of low-level Bloom's taxonomy, but then I make them as part of their case analysis, form an opinion as to whether they think British Petroleum was socially responsible or not. And it's interesting, the number of comments I get, how they still don't like British Petroleum, but their attitude has changed, that maybe they're not as evil as they thought they once were. Heidi mentioned that two of our major employers in the local area are Dow Chemical and Dow Corning, but what she didn't mention is our area of Michigan also used to be a heavily industrialized automotive center. And the automotive industry has undergone, as we all know, some major changes, contractions. And so I've tried to write cases that relate to that. Delphi Automotive, when they were spun off from General Motors, was a big entity in our area. And then they went through their bankruptcy and created an organization. One of their divisions was spun off and became Next Year. And so I wrote a case about the bankruptcy. And again, this ties into ethics and social responsibility so that they can understand the bankruptcy process. And now this is my opinion, obviously, but all the unethical things that are legally allowed to happen in a bankruptcy process. And to ask them to form their opinions on that. And then when they came out of bankruptcy, their one company, Next Year it's called now, was bought by an international company. And I knew a number of Next Year executives, so I wrote talked with them, spoke with them, and got some of their perspectives. And so what I'm trying to do is make these cases something that the students have all heard about in terms of companies that are local, but have large enough issues that they can relate it to a global context. And this is the process we follow. I put together the basic situation. I give them some questions to prod. And again, it's an entry-level class, so I tend to have to hold their hands a little more as we start. I know Heidi does a lot less hand-holding than I do. But the issue is to try and get them kick-started in following this approach. And typically, every once in a while you'll get a situation where a class just will not coalesce. But usually after you've spanked them a few times with you're all going to fail, and they do, they realize you're not just threatening them. Typically it comes together, and it makes it for a very enjoyable experience. Thank you.
He doesn't really spank them.
Figuratively. You don't, I teach them in class, you don't hit your employees, that's insult, and you don't hug them, that's sexual harassment. So you're better off just not touching your employees, because nothing good ever comes from it. So, how does Cengage help? Well, I use for the intro class Pride, Hughes, and Kapoor. It's a formerly Houghton Mifflin text, and they merged with Cengage. And they do an excellent job of providing cases at the end of each chapter. And they also have a little bit of a developing critical thinking skills exercise at the end of each chapter. And again, I find those very useful for the audience that I have. They're not used to this, and so working those exercises and then doing the cases tends to coalesce or correlate well with the material in the book, obviously. And so those materials, they also have online resources, Cengage Learning, Cengage Brain, I think, is one of them, that are a wonderful reference point or resource point for creating these activities. And I use a lot of the ideas that I get from there when I'm writing my own cases to kind of help me formulate how to put these things together. Yep.
Yeah. Another thing that Cengage has is, at least in all my textbooks, a little blurb on different video clips you could use. I don't know if you get those or not, but this past semester, there was a blurb in the book I've never used before, and it was to show a clip on the Goonies. Do you remember that? And I remember the Goonies, from years ago watching it, and I thought, really, how is that even going to work? I thought, I'll do it, I'll try it, right? And I did, and I was surprised at the number of students who just latched onto it. They could wrap their brains around that little clip from the Goonies, and then it led off into a bigger discussion on what happens with property when it's lost or found or abandoned. And that's what we were talking about in classes, is property rights issues, and it was amazing. So it's worthwhile sometimes too then, that wasn't a full case study, but it was a little clip at least about a kind of a case, and it matched in with my case on lost property, which was kind of a cool idea too. So I actually use case studies immediately, like right away on the first day of class. I don't give them to them as homework. I have them do it right in class, and on the very first day they do it. It works great as like an icebreaker if you like to do those kinds of things. It just depends on the size that you design really of the case study, and can they do it in 20 minutes versus do they need it as a 2-hour homework or something. But all right, so if you're intimidated by writing your own and you haven't found any resources that help you, here's like our suggestions anyways for how you might be able to write a case study. I had a colleague years ago that said, I have the students write the test questions, and then they're the test questions for subsequent semesters, which sort of felt like cheating to me. But it's a good way. I mean, it makes them think about it different, and then they're challenging themselves for developing these questions. Kind of takes the heat off of you a little bit as the instructor. So you could have your students try to design them, especially in small groups. I manipulate current events all the time, which is easy for me, I think, in the law. I kind of feel like I have almost the easiest discipline just because of that, because there's always some ridiculous celebrity who's done something illegal, and then I can incorporate it in for contract cases or anything like that. So I'll try to do that and relate it back and forth. But we actually, a couple years ago, there was a guy who lived in the outskirts of the main Tri-County area where we're from, and he had sexually assaulted a dog. Mm-hmm. And in the state of Michigan, the statutes say that you can't have sex with animals. The statutes say you can't have sex with dead people, but they didn't say anything about dead animals. It was really wild. But it was I share this with the students, and it's a shocker. They love it because, you've never heard anything so crazy in your whole life. But it's a good example of, here's a problem in our legislation that hasn't been addressed because nobody in their right minds is going to do this or think about it. And so our state capitol, our representatives haven't thought of it either, but the gap sometimes, like for me in the law, it's good for case studies. So that's the beauty of the current events, because you can bring in those like shocker, crazy things. And you guys all remember Jack Kevorkian, right? Our Dr. Death in Michigan. Mm-hmm. Same scenario. The first people that he assisted or killed, however you feel about it, there was no statute that made it illegal, so they couldn't really do anything with them, and then finally had to pass the statute. So it's kind of fun bringing that stuff in sometimes. So the current events. Cengage Brain has online resources. And then, the other book publishers will send you textbooks to try to get you to switch, and I'll just, steal, really, from those that we don't use and then manipulate them. So sometimes it's worthwhile to keep those around, even if you're not going to use them, for purposes of the case studies anyways. But, okay, and if that's not working for you. Last semester, I missed being in school myself. I think I could have been like if my parents would have given me a trust fund, I would have been a permanent student like forever, I think. And so last semester, I took a class, an English lit class on the Old Testament, just for fun. And in the class, he was saying how when you read the Bible or you read things like fairy tales, watch Disney movies, like whatever, a very good story always starts the exact same way. There's some problem that everybody has, and it has to be something that's relatable that we could, connect to. So, like in the Bible, of course, there's always a famine, and then in fairy tale stories, it's always the evil stepmothers or, something like that, right? Or a parent has died or something. You got to pick a problem that people can relate to. And then a good story then also is all about the relationships between those people. And so that's a way to think about if you're going to write your own case studies. When you're going to talk about a certain topic for that week, or you've got some kind of material out of the textbook that's sort of dry and you want to try to jazz it up, try to think of a common problem that surrounds it that we could all have, and then just manipulate it based on relationships. Throw that problem like into a family scenario, because families end up being a nightmare when something goes wrong, and then that's a way to sort of design the case study, especially as a way for our students to relate, because like Bruce said, at our college, we have an awful lot of developmental students, and there's a big pocket of poverty and low income, and so they're struggling with a lot of different family issues and money issues, and sometimes that's the way to hit it for developing case studies, too.
And that that issue has been exacerbated by our economic situation in the Tri-Counties. Once the auto companies left, you know, a lot of those good paying jobs that you could get without necessarily needing an education went away. And so, yeah, that's created those issues for us. To kind of fill in on what Heidi said, that's one of the reasons why the first thing, they're relatable problem. When I do a lot of my cases, whether that I make up, either short or long, I try to make them all more local so that the students, you know, sometimes they get lost when you start talking about, well, Volkswagen's here right now, right? And so you start talking about Volkswagen. Well, we're General Motors, Ford Motor Company, Chrysler, Fiat company state. They don't necessarily relate well to VW. It's, you know, in a German organization. So you try to make it to businesses that they've heard of a regular time over their life, so that, you know, they all know somebody that worked for General Motors. And in our local area, they all know somebody that worked for Delphi. And so that way, or lost their job from Delphi or whatever. So they can all relate to it, and kind of makes the global issues localized. You know, because at least our students, they tend to get a little lost when you try to, you know, initially at least interconnect what's happening with Japan and what's happening in Saginaw Bay City. You know, it just doesn't seem to work well for us. So it's a way of grabbing their attention.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think Bruce and I both kind of feel that way. That sometimes it's almost like entertainment. You know, how long can you keep their attention when attention spans, what is it calculated at now? Like 10 minutes? So we lost you guys like a long time ago, maybe, right? You know, and so how do you keep like getting that back? And so, oops, oh shoot, oh now I just screwed up. I have the beauty of the law cases, and so I can talk about really ridiculous stuff that I know won't fit into all of your classes probably, but you'd be surprised once you start trying to find them. So. Okay, so here's when you could use case studies. Like I said, I use them the very first day because they're good for icebreakers too. And I have a baseball case actually that I use in all my cases. Well, it's the old the Barry Bonds, Mark McGwire case, where it was the record-breaking ball that popped up into the stands, and there was a huge lawsuit between the two guys that sort of had their hands on the ball and stuff. That case is actually getting kind of old. That was like, what, 10 years ago? Or more, I think. Yeah. Pretty close. Yeah. But the students still sort of have a little bit of a recollection of that. And wonderfully, every single year you see that same sort of scenario at sporting events. You know, not hockey so much, but at other like local baseball avenues. And then, of course, in Detroit we had the Pistons Brawl, which was great for that kind of stuff. So the students seem to connect with some of that. So I do it right from the get-go as like an icebreaker. But the other reason it works out good is because then while we're talking about the case, I show them how I would analyze it, and so it's good for modeling because they're not coming in with the critical thinking skills. They don't even know how to second guess some stuff. You know, they might have a gut reaction like, I think guy A wins, but they're not even totally sure why. And so once you can start laying out like the bullet points for it or your rationale, you're really just modeling the critical thinking skills that they're not used to seeing an awful lot of the time. So that's one way. Case studies are great if you want to do some group time. Especially, I guess, if you need some downtime a little bit, too, in the class and you're tired of doing all the talking, you know. It's kind of nice putting them in a group and then having them work on a case study. And I always thought, you know, at least in cases, you can kind of view stuff a certain way. But it's surprising the number of groups that come out with completely different versions of it or different ways to look at it. In almost all my classes, it's always worked out that way where we've had different, you know, different things to think about or talk about. I do case studies in quizzes, and then I also give all their exams online, which I know is not very popular a lot. Even in my face-to-face classes, I do their exams online because I do, you know, some true false, multiple choice kinds of questions. But then I do little case studies, and it takes a lot then for me to grade them on the outside. But then there's no intimidation anymore taking the test because I got tired of hearing the students, who, well, not tired, but I got upset hearing, you know, the students come in and they're so intimidated by taking the tests. And if everyone's taking a test and somebody gets done early, they start panicking like they're taking too long. And so I tried to take it all out of that. So now they can take my tests at 2 in the morning in their pajamas if they feel like it, if that's the time that works for them. So then you got to worry about if they're cheating or if somebody else is taking the tests then, right, too. So I found using the case studies, especially like right in the beginning, little ones, you start to learn like how they talk, or at least how they type, you know? So I can tell if there's a dramatic difference then between what's happened the first few weeks of class and then what somebody tries to submit to me as the final exam. So I do it in my face-to-face also, but then you could use it that way maybe for your online, your fully online classes too, because I had one person over the years do that. They're beginning case studies, you know, not even complete sentences, the spelling would be bad, they weren't really thinking them through. And by the end of the semester, all of a sudden, it's like their reading and writing levels skyrocketed like 4 grades, and I know that wasn't me, you know, there's just no way. So you can kind of pick up on some of that then a little bit too. So just trying to integrate them different. But
For my assessments in class, or for my classes, I do it a little different. Intro to business is a lot of terminology and language and what have you. So I give tests that get at that, but then I give them a case study as part of the test that's take home. And it's individually done. And just like Heidi said, you can usually tell which ones have been done by the students and which ones they've maybe manufactured. And personally, I'm not opposed to them seeking help from people when they're doing it, because I feel that's part of the learning process. I am opposed to them, you know, having somebody else do it for them. And occasionally you can catch them at it. But it just is something that we feel very strongly about in our discipline, the management discipline, because it's not just Heidi and I that take this approach. It's all the full-time faculty that do it, right from my intro to business and actually in business math, which I also teach, those classes right through our capstone classes. So we try to make sure that our adjunct follow that process as well.
there's another resource that I didn't see on my slide. I must have left it out, or maybe I just didn't catch it. But through our library consortium in Michigan, it's called MEL, I think, or something, Michigan, I forget what the consortium is. But our library at Delta College subscribes to, you know, statewide resources and stuff. And within those resources, Cengage actually has case studies. And they have case studies for, like, every discipline you could think of. So that's an option, too, to check into, especially if you're kind of struggling with the idea of how you're going to be able to integrate case studies into your classes if you don't teach management or law or business or, you know, some of the stuff we're talking about. If it's something different, to go to that through your library, the Cengage resources have a ton of case studies that you can use and manipulate and stuff, too. So.
Yeah, lately we've been working with the accounting faculty. I used to be one, to get them to adopt more of a case study approach. They do in their intermediate and up-level classes, but we've been working with them to try and put more of that into an entry-level class as well, because our students all have to take accounting and they need that information for the capstone.